A reading from Exodus. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight, and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see him, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. And then he said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look to God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to the Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to the Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that this is who has sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. When I was in college, my favorite TV show was a show called Scrubs. The show is a comedy centered on a young medical resident, starting in a hospital, working alongside his best friend, a man named Turk. At one point in the series, Turk discovers that he has diabetes. And over the course of the episode, we begin to see Turk and his wife, Carla, figure out this new diagnosis, but we also see them begin to use his diagnosis as an excuse to get out of things, from doing things with one another or from doing things with other people. By the end of the episode, they have been found out by one another, and instead of getting mad with each other, they decide to team up and to use this new excuse as a collective excuse to get out of things they don't want to do with other people. So in one scene, Carla's on the phone and she calls Turk and says, Turk, we just got invited to Linda's couple's bridal shower. Do you mind if I use your diabetes to get out of it? Turk quickly replies, Of course not, baby. Now the joke here is certainly not his rather serious medical diagnosis, but it is their silly use of it as an avoidance tactic that makes us chuckle. It's humorous because if we're being honest with ourselves, most of us can think of a time when we've come up with some silly excuse to get out of something we didn't want to do. You know, I wish I could help you move into your new apartment with such short notice, but I really need to wash my hair that day. It's human nature to try and avoid certain things we just don't want to do. And so we often make up an excuse to try and get out of those things. And many times our excuses serve simply to avoid hurting the person who's offering something to us. But other times, the excuses we use serve a different purpose. Sometimes our excuses come out of a very real sense of doubt that we are even able to do the very thing we are being asked to consider. There's a profound difference between our saying, I don't want to, and those times when we think, I don't know that I'm good enough, that I've got what it takes. In today's reading from the book of Exodus, this story of Moses' encounter with God on Mount Horeb is a biblical showcase of that kind of excuse-making and that kind of self-doubt. Moses and the burning bush. The imagery of this story has been captured over and over again by artists and writers and filmmakers. In fact, if you'll notice, the cover of your order of service today has a beautiful artist rendering of this very image. You'll have to ask Mark more about that. But for some of you, you'll imagine this story and Cecil B. DeMille's depiction with Charlton Heston might come to mind first. Or for others, perhaps the more recent DreamWorks animated movie, Prince of Egypt. But in some way, we imagine this story, whether we hear it for the first time or hear it again over and over, and we are reminded that this is the beginning of one of the great dramas of Scripture. The return of Moses to Egypt and the great Exodus. But it is, among other things, the story of Moses' calling. This dramatic encounter with God through a burning bush is perhaps unlike any of our own God encounters. But with careful attention, it is not hard to find ourselves in this story. In fact, burning bush and desert mountain aside, our own interaction with God might be more similar to Moses's than we might first imagine. So to give some background, it has been 40 years since Moses left Egypt. Fled would actually be more accurate. He had, after all, once been the prince of Egypt, but then in an effort to save an Israelite, he killed an Egyptian, and then in turn was rejected by the group of people he was trying to save. So he fled, fearing for his life, and he ended up in Midian, working for his father-in-law as a shepherd. And for the past 4 decades, that's where Moses has been. So it's easy to imagine then, given all that has gone on in these past 4 decades, that Moses lacks now the confidence that he once had all those years ago. He was once royalty, but a prince he was no more. Instead, there he was, an 80-year-old shepherd puttering around a desert mountain, tending to his father-in-law's sheep. And this is where our story with Moses today begins. Moses is beyond the wilderness, as the Bible describes it, on Mount Horeb, a deserted and isolated place. Horeb, in fact, quite literally translates to wasteland. And it is here in this mountain wasteland that Moses hears his name and encounters this remarkable blazing bush. As the story tells us, Moses realizes that it is in fact God he is encountering, and his first reaction is to hide himself from God. But then he begins to speak with God, and he removes his shoes as a sign of humility and of submissiveness. He then hears God say, "I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry. I have come down to deliver them from Egypt. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Moses then replies to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" In other words, who, me? Moses was being called to serve God and save his people, and he thought God had the wrong guy. If you keep reading through chapter 4, you'll see that Moses actually pushes back pretty hard against God's request multiple times. Moses offers an excuse back to God, 5 separate excuses. As Presbyterian minister and theologian Robert McAfee Brown put it, Moses ducks and weaves in every possible way to avoid the body blow of the assignment, piling up excuses. It's as if Moses was saying, "I'm not worthy to look at you, but I'll argue with you until I'm blue in the face to keep from doing this thing that I don't want to do." Have any of you had that argument before? Perhaps with God, perhaps with yourself, perhaps like my older brother when he was a kid at the dinner table and he looks to my mom and says, "Look, Mom, I know green beans are good for me, and you're probably right. I should eat them. But here's 5 really good reasons why I don't think I need to eat green beans." Over the last few weeks as a new pastoral resident, I've had the opportunity to share with many of you a little bit about me and my own story. Part of that story is that I am the son and the grandson of Baptist pastors. And many years ago, I made a decision for myself that I was not going to join the family business, as a friend once put it, but instead I was going to do something altogether, something other than ministry. Well, you're all listening to me preach today as an ordained minister, so you already know the punchline to this joke. But the part of my story that I always make sure to tell is this. Just about everything I have done in ministry thus far, I at one time said no to. And some of those times that I said no, that no was a result of my thinking that I just didn't have what it takes. Or maybe God was calling the wrong guy, that I wasn't in some way good enough to live into this calling. Yet, here I am. God was calling me to something greater than myself and greater than my self-doubt, and I finally listened. And that's what Moses' story is about. God was calling Moses to something beyond himself, a calling to serve God and serve God's people. And God's call to Moses was for more than a single selfless act of service, but to a life of service, to serving others as a way of being. Yet Moses was afflicted by the same thought that beats us down far too often. I just don't think I have what it takes. But God's answer to Moses is the same for each of us. You're enough, because I am enough, and I will be with you. Many of you by now will have seen the powerful documentary that was released earlier this summer titled, "Won't You Be My Neighbor?" telling the story of Fred Rogers and the development of his TV show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Whether you have seen this remarkable film or not, and if you haven't, I would highly recommend it, you may already know that Fred Rogers was more than a children's TV personality. He was actually an ordained Presbyterian minister. And in fact, his ordination was specifically as an evangelist for television. Mr. Rogers, as we knew him, spent more than 30 years on TV ministering to millions of children and adults like myself. The documentary tells many stories about Fred Rogers, but there was one in particular that stuck out to me. Despite all that he had done through his TV work, there were moments when he doubted if he even had what it took, if he was the right person for the job, or if what he was doing for all those years was really even making any difference. When 9/11 occurred, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood had already been off the air for about a year. But a decision was made to have Fred Rogers come on air and tape some promos so that children and adults who had listened to him for all those years could hear from a trusted voice in the midst of this devastating tragedy. But it was Fred himself who began to doubt. I just don't know what good these are going to do, he said. He was beaten down by the evil around him and wondered what difference his few words would even make. It was his producer who was quick to remind him, it's always going to be an ongoing struggle to overcome evil. People listen to you. They need to hear from you. And so in October 2001, Fred Rogers spoke these words to a national audience. No matter what our particular job, especially in our world today, we are called to be tikkun olam, repairers of creation. Thank you for whatever you do, wherever you are, to bring joy and light and hope and faith and pardon and love to your neighbor and to yourself. I think that's what accepting God's call to serve is essentially all about. That whatever we do, wherever we are, that we use who we are, who God made us and shapes us to be, to bring light into an ever-darkening world, to serve where we are needed most. God called a herder of sheep to be a shepherd of a different kind, and God even gave him the staff by which to do it. Sure, no one person can do everything, but everyone can at least do something. And it doesn't have to be something big. It doesn't have to be leading a nation of people out of slavery or hosting a television show for 30 years. But all of us can do something, and our excuses can't get in the way. None of us are so busy, so inexperienced, or so ill-equipped that we can't make some difference somewhere, sometime. But we have to first be divinely curious enough, as Moses was, to engage whatever burning bush God has sent our way. We must be open to the miraculous things that God is using to speak to us. We then must be willing to allow God to use us to make a difference in the world. There's trouble in the world. There is oppression happening all around us. And it would be easy to think, who am I to do anything about that? But the answer is, you are the one God is calling to make a difference. Living into this calling is usually not as complicated as we make it out to be either. The good news is the call God gives us, like Moses, is usually something that we are already familiar with and something we are already passionate for. Despite his objections, Moses was already prepared by his own experience, and he cared deeply for those whom he was going to serve. Likewise, we all have our unique God-given gifts, experiences, and passions that make us ready to do what God is calling us for. We just have to ask, what am I already equipped to do to make a difference? Where does my passion, where do my gifts intersect with the needs of the world? That's the place God is calling us to. That's the place where God is waiting for us to join in and get to work. And it's different for everyone. Maybe for some, it's helping with the food bank to help fight against hunger, because hunger has been a part of your story too. Maybe it's volunteering here on Fridays with Friday Friends because you also had a loved one with dementia, or because you know how important it is to give caretakers a break. Perhaps it's working with refugees because you know what it's like to be a stranger, and you take seriously the call to love your neighbor as yourself. Maybe you have the gift of time and the gift of hospitality, and you want to visit those who are homebound or in need of a friend. Whatever it is, God is calling you to make a difference. And with God, we are enough to make that difference. This Friday, I have the great privilege to go to the Prison Entrepreneurship Program Business Plan Competition in Venus, Texas. It'll be my first time attending an event related to prison ministry. I'm excited to go, and I'll be there along with other Wilshire members. Jimmy Ward and others will be there. And part of our task is to sit and hear business plans put together by inmates as a way of working towards a certificate of entrepreneurship in partnership with Baylor University. So I RSVP'd for this event and got back an auto-generated email that had information for what I needed to know for the day. But what caught my attention was that the beginning of the email started, "Dear Difference Maker." I thought, well, who am I to make a difference? I'm going for one day and spending a few hours with people I don't really know, and I'll listen for a while and give some encouragement and then move on. But what if that is the posture we begin to take as we look at the world for ourselves? What if we hear God's voice saying, "Dear Difference Maker"? How might we then approach the world around us and serve those who are in need, knowing that we have something, even a few moments of our time, to make a difference? The world is crying out as God, and God is calling us from wherever we are, and where we stand is holy ground because God is already there, ready for us to take off our shoes and get to work. No excuses. Amen.